1966 was a complicated year in the Beatles' career. John Lennon's comments about Jesuschrist affected the band's image considerably. Incidental situations in the tours became more and more frequent, from the mistreatment in the Philippines to the protests in Japan to stop them from performing at the Budokan. The press conferences were more and more tense. The band's relationship was wearing out, and they gave the impression of being distant. John, George, and Ringo were already married men, and McCartney was moving away from family life to get involved in movements that were in London in those years. As the months went by, the composition evenings between Lennon and McCartney were less frequent. They all started to work on their own, to have alternate projects. Live, things were not looking good. They received threats in every city, and they would experience their last American tour a few months later, hand in hand with their interest in studio work, experimentation, and artistic evolution as their escape route, and already with the basis of an album as an artistic piece in Rubber Soul. Revolver represented a radical change in the rules of the game. Recorded between April 6th and June 21st, 1966, and marked by the growing wear of the Beatles in terms of their figures, physically and mentally. They were reaching a critical limit of exhaustion and overexposure. They feared for their lives and their safety after certain accidents, and the band was already exploring the possibility of leaving the tours. They no longer had to worry. They had enough money to allow them to continue experimenting. Revolver was to be the album that took the longest time to record for the band. In the recording dynamics, there were changes. Norman Smith, the sound engineer, left the band. To replace him came Geoff Emerick. He gained the complete respect of the group. Emerick was an important part of the development of the band and its evolution, who could capture and turn into reality the ideas of the Beatles and be a fundamental piece in the recording of an album. With a tour of Germany, Japan, and the Philippines, followed by a tour of North America, the Beatles would experience one of their most complicated periods, marked by John Lennon's words that affirmed that the Beatles were more popular than Jesuschrist in the United Kingdom, and the same words that, when reproduced in the USA, caused an uproar among a sector of the American public, added to other scandals in other countries. All of this ended on August 29th, when the Beatles decided to leave the concerts. Their last single, Paperback Writer and Rain, released on May 30th, 1966. It was a sample path that was soon to inaugurate Revolver. Just like their first album, Revolver starts with a countdown. They were no longer the same. Taxman in particular offers a plausible beginning of a repetitive riff that accompanies Harrison's serious voice, who for the first time opens a Beatles album. Developing taxes as his main theme, George Harrison brings a change in popular music for his particularity in the lyrics. What other artist would be talking about taxes at that time? A song of complaint to the British Treasury that took approximately 96% of the gross income of the Beatles, who were a complete goldmine for the country, and one of its main sources of income. This period gave Harrison another status as a composer. Added to Paul McCartney's excellent guitar solo and Ringo's frenetic rhythm, Taxman is the perfect start.
Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church.
After starting comes this Baroque pop song, directly influenced by pet sounds of the Beach Boys. If taxes were a new precedent for popular music themes of the time, this one deals with oppression, death, loneliness, and existential drama. With its dark characters and its string arrangements with funeral overtones, make this song a sophisticated theme, inspired by the actress Eleanor Braun, who had worked with the Beatles in Help. Eleanor Rigby is buried in a Liverpool cemetery that McCartney used to go to in his childhood. Just meters away was a John Mackenzie, characters that McCartney could have taken unconsciously from his childhood or adolescent memories. Or, according to Paul, it could be a completely strange coincidence. But beyond that, George's introduction to the album, followed by McCartney's, could not be followed better than with a John Lennon song. It is a testimony of a difficult period for John. A year before he wrote Help, he also stopped composing with Paul McCartney and embarked on a depression that led him to lie on the couch for days, even weeks. Present but absent, as his wife Cynthia Powell described him. After a period in which Lennon felt suffocated, depressed, and locked up, emerging as a vision of an exhausted and immature artist who, under the effects of joints or acid, refused to face his responsibilities, in the words of his wife. But in spite of everything, Lennon enjoys his position and asks not to be disturbed, that he's in the middle of a dream and in which he begs not to be ruined. It ended up being a lysergic rock, just like Rain, used with the guitars played backwards. Appearing in a key way in the solo of the song, the treatment of Lennon's vocals is almost impeccable, and it is an interesting theme to analyze in depth. Beyond the nods that Indian culture had with the Beatles' career, here came a direct theme focused on Hindu music. Harrison, fascinated by the music of Ravi Shankar, embarked on the culture and traditions of India. Harrison knew how to perfectly combine his two visions of life at the time. The Beatles had never sounded like this. In the session, Only Ringo and Paul were invited, but this time they did not contribute too much. Harrison makes a gloomy record, a critique of the material world that he would develop much more years later in his solo career. McCartney said for many years that this was his favorite song, a romantic ballad that was praised by John Lennon also as his favorite. It is a song similar to the sophisticated ballads that were characteristic of Rubber Soul, and that in Revolver evokes the feeling of love as rarely a mature love, influenced again by the pet sounds and directly by God Only Knows, whose simplicity creates a complex theme. Here they did not resort to sonorous experiments. It seems to be perfect.
We all live in a yellow submarine.
It is not easy to create children's melodies, and although it is not known if it was created with that in mind, we know that it was written in the necessity to give Ringo his song of every album. One night, unable to sleep, Paul McCartney wrote down ideas about yellow submarines. After successfully conceiving of a catchy chorus, he imagined children singing the song during school trips. When McCartney brought the unfinished song into the studio, Lennon told him it was garbage. And between McCartney, Lennon, and Donovan, they polished the lyrics to give it the finishing touch it needed. Inspired by sound effects from Bob Dylan's Rainy Day Women, Yellow Submarine was recorded and became a band anthem, a number one, and one of their most catchy songs. This album probably contains the strangest songs ever written by John Lennon. This track is another influence of Lennon on acid, who with a rock of the same nature seems to be the sequel of I'm Only Sleeping. It gives the impression that the first three tracks of Lennon in this album share the same sound, counting the two mentioned and adding Dr. Robert. Peter Fonda is related to the first line because in a meeting with John Lennon in 1965, he told him, "I know what it's like to be dead." The middle part of the song was part of another song that was added in the studio.
Good day, sunshine.
Paul McCartney's merit in this album is that no song is like any other, and this is another example of his versatility as a composer, who in this song brings us music hall sounds, a classic touch that fits the unstoppable evolution of the band, something similar to what the Kinks were doing. However, McCartney's influence for this song was Daydream by the Lovin' Spoonful. The song advocates dissent and is an excellent B-side opening. John Lennon considered it awful, and for many, the song may be one of Revolver's least impressive songs. We cannot take away from its merit. Perhaps the derogatory treatment of its author reduced the interest of many specialists. After a dozen takes that seemed more boring as they progressed, the band was able to give it rhythm and achieve in Harrison's guitars a complexity that improves the song.
Your day breaks, your mind aches.
Another one of the great songs, sublime and spectacular. Paul McCartney demonstrated that when he wanted to write sophisticated and deep lyrics, he could do it, without any problem. With For No One, McCartney contributed a hard theme of heartbreak. George Martin received it with pleasure, because he knew that in these themes, just as he had done with Yesterday and many others, he could put a part of his talent. Speaking of love and abandonment, For No One is shaped by its excellent solo with the French horn, which is attached to McCartney's bitter voice and the excellent performance of the harpsichord. George and John limited themselves to watching and taking observations, and only Paul and Ringo played throughout 10 takes. Dr. Robert was a joke among the Beatles, a strange doctor from New York who gave pills of practically everything, and for everyone. He somehow kept the artistic community of the city on a level. A doctor of pills that makes you feel good. The identity of the doctor remains mysterious to this day, and although there's a combination of two doctors of the time, others point out that it was the same, Robert Zimmerman. Bob Dylan. Another mockery that has apologies to drug use. The song, written by John Lennon, had a new effect. He did not have to dub his voice this time, because the new automatic voice dubbing system was released, which was a relief for John, as he hated to be dubbing his voice in the songs.
I want to tell you.
A song with philosophical airs that expressed the little capacity of the human being to express feelings. The song begins in an ascending way, just as 8 Days a Week had done. It enjoys an excellent melody. In the perception of many, it was not given enough time in the studio to improve it. Paul McCartney adopts Motown sounds. At first, the song was completely different and gradually took form. The brass gave the song its essence. At the beginning, and as rarely, McCartney didn't know exactly what he wanted, and that's why the anthology track is so different. He recruited a super brass band from London, and already in the studio with George Martin, the score was written for the brass. Jeff Emmerich has merit in the way the brass sounds because of the positioning of the microphones, and after finishing the session, they kept it for a month. Then they put the finishing touches. The most sophisticated, complex, and innovative track on the album, completely amazing. and a perfect closing idea of John Lennon, who told the newly arrived Geoff Emerick that he wanted to sound like the Dalai Lama, and Lennon was ready to hang from a rope around the studio and throw himself from one side to the other while singing. To everyone's good fortune, Geoff Emerick was able to solve Lennon's request without any problems, and everyone was amazed with the result. It was the first song that was worked on for the album, and ironically, it ended up being the last song on the album. Released on August 5th in England, the album represented the pinnacle of the Beatles' complexity and experimentation up to that point. Although it arrived in stores at the same time as the Jesus controversy, critics and the public appreciated the group's audacity, and the album reached the top spot on both sides of the Atlantic. The critics were surprised. When the band gave the impression of not being able to do better, they surpassed themselves again and again. Revolver represented leaving behind the image of the Beatles that the world knew. It contained songs that broke with everything that their contemporaries were doing. A complete and experimental album. With Revolver, everything was different. This time, Robert Freeman, former Beatles photographer, did not take the main photograph. The band trusted his old German friend Klaus Voormann, who designed a photographic collage assembled with many of Freeman's black and white photographs. Attached to the drawings that showed an innovative cover, the first one without having the Beatles in a photograph in a precise way, and like their previous album, it dispensed again with the band's name. The innovation in the cover led to graphic designers to take it as a guideline to design covers of the music, creating the industry of the icons that transcend until our times. To put a simple photograph was finished forever. The music production surrendered before the power of the image. Capitol Records always used to move the songs on the Beatles' American albums. On this occasion, they did not put their filler tracks, but had to issue 3 Revolver tracks that were included on Yesterday and Today. So the American album was only 27 minutes long, and under this version, the American Revolver album had more songs by George Harrison than John Lennon. The title Revolver referred to the movement of the turntable platter and not to a gun. Never had the Beatles required so much time to record an album, almost 3 months. That would be too short for what was to come next. The Father Mackenzie in Eleanor Rigby was originally Father McCartney, but Paul decided to change it to avoid misunderstandings that people would relate it to his father, James McCartney. Eleanor Rigby was inspired by Truffaut's film Fahrenheit 451, which contained arrangements by Bernard Herrmann on the soundtrack. It seemed incredible, but the Beatles had overcome the barriers they had built. Revolver had sounds never heard before. If marijuana had been fundamental in Rubber Soul, other drugs would be part of the history of Revolver, which offers different landscapes that face with total freedom. The variety of styles dominated by the group as psychedelic rock, pop, romantic ballads, Hindu mysticism, Victorian style, soul, music hall, and even had a children's song, resulting in a continuous discovery in their sounds. After releasing the album, they would stop touring and start their new era. So, we end this chapter of Music Box. Subscribe to our channel and comment, what other albums would you like to see on this channel? Thanks for watching. This is Music Box.